She had 30 seconds to decide whether her son would live free or die trying. Somewhere behind her, dogs were already barking. Ahead, a swamp stretched out, black and bottomless in the moonless dark, filled with water moccasins, quicksand, and things no overseer would ever willingly enter. Mary Carter looked at that swamp and understood something most people never have to confront in their entire lives. That the most dangerous place in front of her was still safer than the place behind her. She grabbed her son's hand and ran. What unfolded over the next several months would transform a 42-year-old field hand and her 19-year-old son into the most hunted fugitives in the state of Mississippi. Plantation owners would pool their money. Professional slave catchers would be summoned from 3 counties. Dogs bred specifically for this purpose would be unleashed into the wilderness. And still, mother and son would vanish again and again into a landscape. They had turned into their own private weapon. There would be nights of freezing river water closing over their heads. There would be a rifle taken from the very men sent to capture them. Turned back against the terror of their pursuit, there would be a tracker so skilled, so relentless, that his own employer came to believe no one could outlast him, and a mother who would prove him wrong. There would be moments in the deep fog of the swamp when even Mary and Elijah themselves wondered whether this was the night it finally ended. This is the story of how they did it, and why, more than once, the hunters became the hunted. This story is for educational and informational purposes, focusing on documented resistance during the slave trade era. We aim to honor the forgotten stories of those who fought against oppression. Welcome to Vale of Fear, where history's forgotten stories are brought back to life. Before we begin, let us know where you're watching from by commenting with your city and the current time. If you enjoy uncovering hidden chapters of history, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us continue sharing these remarkable stories and introduces them to more people around the world. Now, let's dive into today's story. To understand why Mary Carter ran, you first have to understand what she was running from. And it wasn't a single moment of cruelty. It was a slow, grinding machine that had been closing in on her for years. Mary was born into bondage on a cotton plantation outside Natchez, Mississippi, sometime around 1799, though like most enslaved people, she never had an official record of her birth. What she did have from an early age was an understanding of her own precariousness. Enslaved people were property under Mississippi law. They could be sold, traded, mortgaged, or gambled away with less legal ceremony than a farmer selling a mule. And nothing terrified an enslaved mother more than the auction block, because it was there, more than the whip, more than the overseer's boot, that families were torn apart forever. By the time Elijah was born in 1822, Mary had already lost 2 children to sale, a daughter sold at age 6 to a trader, heading toward the Louisiana sugar plantations, where mortality rates for enslaved workers were catastrophically high, and a younger son sold at 11 months old when the plantation's owner needed cash to cover a gambling debt. Mary never learned what became of either child. This was by design. Slaveholders understood that severing all contact, no letters, no visits, no way to trace a sold relative, was itself a form of control. Grief without information is a wound that never closes, and a mother consumed by grief is a mother less likely to resist. Mary carried both losses in a place she rarely allowed anyone to see, folding her grief into the rhythms of daily survival the way so many enslaved mothers were forced to do. She remembered her daughter's laugh, high and quick, and the particular way the girl had hummed while she worked, a habit she'd picked up from Mary herself. She remembered the weight of her infant son in her arms in the final hour before the traitor took him. The way his small fist had curled around her finger, as though he understood somehow what was about to happen. These memories did not fade with time. They sharpened in the peculiar way that grief sharpens rather than dulls when a person is never permitted the space to properly mourn. It was this accumulated grief, more than any single incident of cruelty, that eventually hardened into Mary's unshakable resolve. She had already survived the worst thing slavery could do to a mother. Twice over. By the time Whitfield's financial troubles put Elijah's name on a sale list, Mary understood with total clarity that she would rather die attempting escape than survive a third loss she had the power to prevent. So when Elijah was born, Mary made a private, dangerous vow. She decided she would not lose this child. She didn't know exactly how she would keep that vow, but she carried it with her every single day. Through every field row, through every whipping she absorbed rather than let fall on him, through every moment she taught him quietly, secretly, in violation of Mississippi law, how to recognize the letters on a feed sack, how to track the moss on a tree trunk to find north, how to move through brush without snapping a branch. She was preparing him even when she couldn't admit it to herself. Elijah grew up strong, fast, and sharp-eyed in ways that made the overseers nervous. There is a particular danger on a plantation in being an enslaved young man who is clearly intelligent and clearly watching everything. Overseers called it an attitude. What it actually was a young man cataloging every weakness in the system that held him captive. Which dogs were slow? Which patrollers drank too much to stay alert past midnight? Which sections of fence line went unwalked for days at a time? Mary watched this happen with a mixture of pride and terror. Pride because she recognized in her son the same sharpness that had kept her alive through decades of bondage. Terror because that same sharpness was exactly the trait most likely to get a young enslaved man killed. She spent years walking a careful line, encouraging Elijah's observations in private while teaching him, sometimes harshly, the art of appearing docile in public. Let your eyes do the thinking, she would tell him, gripping his shoulders in the dim light of their cabin. Never your face, never your mouth. There was one incident when Elijah was 15 that Mary would carry with her for the rest of her life. An overseer named Dobbs, a cruel man known throughout the county for his temper, caught Elijah staring a moment too long after a whipping was administered to another enslaved man for the crime of walking too slowly to the fields. Dobbs raised his hand to strike the boy across the face. Mary, working nearby, stepped between them without thinking, absorbing the blow herself. She spent 3 days unable to see clearly out of her left eye. She never regretted it. It was, she later told Elijah, the easiest decision she ever made, easier than the decision to run, easier than any decision before or since. A mother does not calculate the cost of protecting her child. She simply acts. It was around this same period that Solomon entered Elijah's life in a meaningful way. Solomon was an older enslaved man, believed to be in his 60s, whose earlier years had included an extended period living among a Choctaw community in the region before being recaptured and sold back into plantation slavery. He rarely spoke about that period of his life, but what knowledge he retained from it. Tracking, trapping, reading weather patterns, identifying edible plants, moving silently through dense woodland. He passed to Elijah in fragments over several years. Usually during the rare stolen hours, enslaved people were permitted for their own use on Sunday afternoons. Solomon never explicitly told Elijah why he was teaching him these things. He didn't have to. Both of them understood, without ever saying it aloud, that this knowledge was preparation for a day that might never come. but that both of them hoped for anyway. When Solomon died in the early months of 1841, worn down by decades of forced labor and respiratory illness that went untreated, as was common for enslaved people denied adequate medical care, Elijah felt the loss as both a personal grief and the closing of a door. He had learned everything Solomon had to teach. What he did with that knowledge was now entirely up to him. By 1841, Elijah was 19 years old, and the plantation's owner, a man named Josiah Whitfield, had fallen deeply into debt after a series of bad cotton yields and a costly expansion of his acreage. Debt on a slave plantation always meant one thing eventually: liquidation of human property to satisfy creditors. Word reached the slave quarters the way it always did. Through the kitchen house, through a cook who overheard a conversation not meant for her ears, passed hand to hand like contraband. Whitfield was planning to sell off a portion of his enslaved workforce within the month. Elijah's name was on the list. Mary heard this news in the wash house, wringing out linens with hands that had gone still the moment the words reached her. She had lost 2 children to the market. She was not going to lose a third. That night, she found Elijah behind the smokehouse and told him what she'd heard. She expected fear. She expected anger. What she got instead was a question that told her he had already been thinking about this far longer than she realized. When do we leave? Not if. When. Escape from slavery was never a single decision. It was hundreds of decisions made carefully over weeks, often in silence, often in code, always under threat of death if discovered. Mississippi law treated the harboring or planning of an escape as a capital offense in many circumstances, and the punishment for a captured runaway could range from mutilation to execution, depending on the temperament of the enslaver and the local authorities. Mary and Elijah knew this. Everyone on the plantation knew this, and they moved forward anyway. Their first advantage was Mary's decades of quiet observation. She had spent years noting which roads the patrollers rode, which nights the moon would be dark, which weeks the overseer traveled to Natchez for supplies and left the plantation thinly guarded. She knew the rhythms of the place the way a prisoner learns the rhythms of a guard rotation. Not because anyone taught her, but because her survival had always depended on it. Their second advantage was Elijah's physical capability. Years of forced labor had made him powerfully built, and stolen hours spent hunting small game with snares, a skill passed to him by an older enslaved man named Solomon, who had spent time among Choctaw communities before being recaptured, had given him a working knowledge of tracking, trapping, and moving silently through wooded terrain. Their third advantage, and perhaps the most important one, was the network they didn't fully control, but could tap into: informal, dangerous, whispered lines of communication between enslaved people on neighboring plantations, free black communities in river towns, and in rare cases, sympathetic white residents who, for reasons ranging from religious conviction to simple decency, were willing to offer food, shelter, or silence to people fleeing north. Mary and Elijah began preparing in early October 1841. They stole small amounts of cornmeal and dried meat over several weeks, hiding it in a hollow log near the tree line, never enough at once to be noticed missing. Solomon, before his death earlier that year, had told Elijah about a series of natural landmarks: creek forks, distinctive rock formations, a lightning-split oak that could guide a person north along a route that avoided the main roads entirely. Elijah committed this to memory the way a person memorizes a prayer, repeating it silently in the fields and in his bunk until it became instinct. They also had to solve a problem that faced every enslaved person contemplating escape: how to plan in secret when privacy itself was almost non-existent. Cabins were cramped. Walls were thin, and a careless word overheard by the wrong person, whether out of malice, fear, or the simple hope of currying favor with an overseer, could end everything before it began. Mary and Elijah developed a rudimentary code, discussing their plans in fragments disguised as ordinary conversation about fieldwork, weather, or Mary's herb gathering. A comment about getting the north field ready before the rain might actually mean confirming the timing of their departure. A remark about the old Miller Trail being overgrown might refer to a specific route Solomon had once described. It was crude, improvised, and utterly necessary. They also had to prepare for a possibility. Neither of them spoke aloud, but both understood clearly that the escape might fail, and that failure carried a punishment far worse than the daily brutality they already endured. Mississippi's legal and social response to captured runaways was designed explicitly as deterrence. Public, humiliating, and often savagely violent, intended to discourage every enslaved person who might otherwise consider the same choice. Mary had witnessed such punishments before. She made her peace with the risk in the same private, resolute way she had made peace with every other danger in her life. Elijah, watching his mother's calm in the face of that risk, drew his own courage from hers. They chose their departure date carefully. A moonless night in late October. A time when Whitfield himself would be away, negotiating the sale of the enslaved people on his list, leaving the overseer short-handed and the patrol rotation thinner than usual. On the night of the escape, Mary did something that revealed the full weight of what she was risking. She left behind a small carved wooden bird, the only possession she owned that had belonged to her mother. Tucked into the wall of her cabin, in a hollow space known only to a woman she trusted, an elderly enslaved cook named Bula. It wasn't sentimentality, it was insurance. If Mary and Elijah were captured and killed, she wanted something of her mother's line to remain hidden, safe, uncatalogued by any auctioneer's ledger, a piece of her family that the system could never sell. Then she took her son's hand, and they slipped into the tree line behind the quarters. And Mississippi's Cotton Kingdom lost 2 of its captives before the sun rose. What Mary and Elijah didn't know that first night was that their escape would not stay quiet for long. Within 72 hours, Josiah Whitfield would return from his business trip, discover 2 of his most valuable enslaved workers missing, and do something that would change the entire scale of the manhunt. He would post a reward so large that men from 3 counties would drop what they were doing and pick up a rifle. By the end of the first week, Mary and Elijah wouldn't just be runaways. They would be the most talked about fugitives in the region. And the hunt that followed would test every skill Mary had spent 19 years quietly building into her son. The forest at night is a different world than the forest by day, and Mary and Elijah entered it with nothing but a stolen kitchen knife, a tinderbox wrapped in oil, the hidden cache of food from the hollow log, and Solomon's remembered directions burned into Elijah's mind. They moved fast and low through the first stretch of pine woods bordering the plantation, staying off the obvious deer trails that patrollers sometimes checked. Instead, cutting through denser brush that would tear at their clothes and skin, but leave almost no visible trace of passage. Mary had told Elijah something years earlier that he now repeated to himself with every step: the easiest path is always the most watched path. By dawn, they had covered nearly 11 miles, an extraordinary distance for a single night's travel through unfamiliar terrain, achieved only because both of them understood that the first 24 hours were the most dangerous of the entire escape. Patrollers would ride hardest and search widest before a trail went cold, before rain or wind erased footprints. before scent faded for tracking dogs. Twice during that first night, they froze at the sound of hoofbeats on a distant road, pressing themselves flat into the underbrush, hearts hammering until the sound faded into the darkness. Once, a barred owl exploded from a branch directly above Elijah's head, and it took every ounce of discipline he possessed not to cry out. Mary gripped his wrist in the dark. A silent reminder stillness was survival. Panic was death. Near the middle of the night, they crossed a shallow creek, and Mary insisted they wade upstream against the current for nearly a quarter mile before climbing out on the opposite bank. A deliberate act of scent disruption that would become a signature of their entire journey. Elijah's feet, unaccustomed to hours of cold water, had gone numb by the time they emerged. But he said nothing. He had learned in 19 years of bondage that complaint accomplished nothing except drawing attention, and old habits, even ones formed under cruelty, proved useful now in an entirely different context. They reached the edge of the cypress swamp just as gray light began filtering through the canopy. And here, Mary made a decision that would define their entire strategy for the months ahead. Instead of skirting the swamp to stay on drier ground, the instinct most fugitives followed, since swamps were treacherous, snake-infested, and exhausting to cross. She led Elijah directly into it. "Dogs lose the scent in water," she told him. "And most men who chase us won't follow us in here. They're too afraid of what's in it." She was right on both counts. Slave catchers of the era relied heavily on scent, tracking dogs, often trained specifically for pursuing fugitives, and these dogs were devastatingly effective on dry land, but far less reliable once a trail crossed standing water repeatedly. Mississippi slave catchers also knew that swamps like the ones bordering the Mississippi River bottomlands were home to venomous cottonmouths, alligators in the southern reaches, and disorienting terrain that could swallow a man whole if he didn't know what he was doing. Most pursuers, given the choice, would rather wait at the swamp's edge than enter it. The swamp itself tested them immediately. Water moccasins, sluggish in the cooled autumn temperatures, but still dangerous, coiled along half-submerged logs. Elijah nearly stepped on twice in the gray early light. Cypress knees jutted up from the black water at irregular intervals, threatening ankles and shins with every step. The mud beneath the water surface pulled at their feet with a suction that made every stride an act of effort. And within an hour, both of them were soaked to the chest, shivering despite the exertion of movement. But Mary moved through it with a confidence that startled Elijah. Testing the ground ahead with a long stick before committing her weight, reading subtle changes in watercolor and vegetation that told her which channels held solid footing beneath and which concealed the kind of sucking mud that could trap a person until exhaustion or drowning finished the job. She had learned this, she told him quietly as they picked their way deeper into the cypress stands. Not from any single teacher, but from decades of listening to old stories passed among the enslaved community about others who had tried and failed to escape through swamp country, from the rare enslaved trapper permitted to work the wetlands for the plantation's benefit, from her own careful observation of the herons and otters that moved through this terrain with an ease that suggested safe, reliable paths beneath the water's deceptive surface. Mary and Elijah entered it, and for the first time since fleeing the plantation, they found something that felt, however briefly, like safety. Josiah Whitfield returned to his plantation on the third day after the escape and flew into a rage that his overseer would later describe in a letter to a business associate as fury unlike anything I have witnessed in the man. It wasn't merely the financial loss, though that alone was significant. Mary and Elijah represented a combined value that, in period terms, would have been worth well over thousands. An enormous sum for the era. It was the humiliation. A prominent slaveholder losing not one, but two enslaved people. A mother and son acting in coordinated defiance. Sent a message to every other enslaved person on his plantation and every neighboring plantation that resistance was possible. That message terrified enslavers more than almost anything else, because their entire system depended on enslaved people believing that escape was hopeless. Whitfield placed an advertisement in the local newspaper, a common practice throughout the antebellum South, offering a substantial reward for the capture and return of both fugitives. The advertisement described Mary as a woman of dark complexion, quick in her movements, and known to be cunning, and Elijah as a young man of unusual size and strength, likely to be armed and dangerous if cornered. Whitfield also reached out personally to several professional slave catchers he had used before, men who made their living tracking fugitives across county lines for a percentage of the reward. Within a week, a coordinated search had assembled that included Whitfield's own overseer and several hired hands, at least 2 professional slave catching outfits with their own dog packs, and informal patrol groups drawn from neighboring plantations, all of whom had a vested interest in discouraging escape attempts among their own enslaved populations. Slave patrols, organized groups, sometimes government-sanctioned, tasked with policing the movement of enslaved people, patrolled the roads, checkpoints, and river crossings throughout the county. Mary and Elijah's names, or at least their descriptions, spread through Mississippi's plantation network with startling speed. In river towns, free black dock workers heard whispered updates from travelers. In slave quarters across 3 counties, the story of the mother and son who dared to run together, rather than separately, took on an almost mythic quality. Some enslaved people prayed for their success. Others feared what would happen to them, and anyone connected to them, if they were caught. The search itself operated with a grim efficiency that reflected just how seriously Mississippi's enslaving class treated any successful act of resistance. Search parties divided the surrounding countryside into rough sectors, riding a circuit of roads, fords, and known trails from dawn until well past dusk. Handbills bearing Mary and Elijah's descriptions were nailed to posts at every crossroad and settlement for 20 miles in every direction. Ferrymen and toll operators were instructed to watch for a woman and young man traveling together. And in several documented cases from the era, similar instructions extended to steamboat captains along the major rivers, since a successful escape by water was one of the few methods capable of covering enormous distances in a short time. Whitfield himself rode out with the initial search parties for the first several days, driven as much by wounded pride as by financial calculation, though he eventually returned to managing his plantation's affairs, leaving the day-to-day pursuit to the men he had hired. He made it known through the overseer that any enslaved person on his plantation caught spreading sympathetic rumors about the fugitives or expressing anything less than proper condemnation of their escape would face consequences. It was a warning that chilled the quarters into a careful, watchful silence. Though silence, as Whitfield would eventually learn, was not the same thing as compliance. The hunt was on, and it was bigger than either of them could have imagined. For the next several weeks, Mary and Elijah lived a life defined by constant motion, constant vigilance, and a slowly deepening intimacy with terrain that would have destroyed most people unfamiliar with it. They developed a system. Elijah, drawing on Solomon's teachings, set snares each evening in likely game trails: rabbit, squirrel, occasionally a wild turkey, supplementing the dwindling supply of stolen cornmeal. Mary, whose knowledge of edible and medicinal plants had been passed down from her own mother, identified pokeweed, wild onion, persimmons, and other forage that kept them from starving, even when snares came up empty. She also knew which plants could treat the cuts, insect bites, and infections that inevitably accumulated during weeks of wilderness travel. A poultice of crushed plantain leaf for wounds, willow bark for pain and fever. They avoided fire during daylight hours, since its smoke could be seen for miles and instantly betray a location. At night, when they dared to build one at all, they dug small pits and kept flames low using dry, smokeless wood that Mary had taught Elijah to identify. They slept in shifts, one always watching, and developed a set of silent hand signals to communicate danger without a single sound. They learned to read the forest itself as an early warning system. A sudden silence among birds often meant a predator, human or animal, had entered the area. Deer bolting from cover in a specific direction told them where not to go. And they moved constantly, never sleeping in the same location twice, doubling back on their own trails to confuse pursuers, crossing and recrossing streams to break their scent trail, occasionally walking backward for short stretches to leave misleading footprints. Mary had absorbed decades of overheard conversations between overseers and slave catchers, discussing the habits of runaways, and she used every scrap of that knowledge now, turning the hunter's own expertise against them. Word of near encounters filtered back to the plantations through captured runaways from other states, through informants, through slave catchers themselves grumbling in taverns about the mother and son team that kept slipping through their fingers. More than once, a search party reached a recently abandoned camp, still warm coals, a snare with fresh blood, footprints leading in 4 different directions before vanishing at a creek bed, only to find the fugitives already gone, sometimes by mere hours. There were quieter moments. 2 moments that period narratives of similar fugitive journeys often leave out in favor of tales of chase and danger, but which mattered just as much to Mary and Elijah's survival. Moments of unexpected tenderness carved out of an otherwise brutal existence. Nights when the weather held clear and the immediate danger felt distant enough to breathe. Mary would tell Elijah stories about his sisters and brother, the children sold away before he was born, weaving their memory into the world he now moved through, so that they too, in some fragile way, traveled north with him. Elijah, in turn, taught his mother to skin and dress the small game he trapped with a speed and precision that would have astonished the overseers who once called him lazy and slow-witted behind his back. Labels applied to enslaved people who had simply learned never to work faster than absolutely required. There was a night in mid-November when an early cold snap caught them without adequate shelter, and they were forced to dig into a natural hollow beneath an uprooted tree, packing the gaps with leaves and pine boughs, huddling together through a night so cold that ice formed on the edges of a nearby creek by morning. Mary later told Elijah that night was strangely one of the moments she felt most certain they would survive. Not because the danger had lessened, but because they had faced something neither slave catcher nor dog could threaten them with, and endured it together, using only their own resourcefulness. Not every encounter with another human being during this period was hostile. On 2 separate occasions, Mary and Elijah crossed paths with other enslaved people moving through the same wilderness corridors. Men and women who, like them, had chosen the terrifying uncertainty of flight over the guaranteed suffering of bondage. These encounters were brief, wary, and conducted mostly in whispers, since trust between strangers in this situation was a luxury neither party could fully afford. But in both cases, small kindnesses were exchanged: a portion of foraged food, a warning about a patrol spotted 2 days prior, directions to a creek crossing that avoided a stretch of road known to be heavily watched. These fleeting alliances, undocumented and largely lost to history, represented one of the quieter forms of solidarity that helped sustain fugitives throughout the region during this era. This is when the legend began to grow. But evading capture through skill and terrain was only going to work for so long. Slave catchers were professionals. They had faced clever fugitives before, and they had methods for closing the gap that had nothing to do with brute tracking, bribery, betrayal, and brutal persistence among them. And then came the night that changed everything. The night Mary and Elijah stopped simply running from the men hunting them and started fighting back. It happened in late November, roughly 5 weeks after the escape, in a stretch of dense bottomland forest along a tributary creek that fed into the larger river system. Mary and Elijah had made camp in a defensible position, a slight rise of ground surrounded by thick brush with only one clear approach. A habit Mary insisted on every single night, regardless of how exhausted they were. It was Elijah who heard the dogs first, distant but unmistakable, and drawing closer with a steadiness that meant the animals had picked up a fresh trail, not a cold one. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Mary's mind raced through every option, discarding each one as quickly as it formed. Running blind would exhaust them and give the mounted men the advantage of open pursuit. Climbing for height offered no real escape, only a trap with no way down. Splitting up was unthinkable. She had not survived 5 weeks of running to lose her son to a moment of tactical convenience. What remained was the option she had spent her entire life preparing for without knowing it. Use the land itself as a weapon. The same way she had used it every single night since they'd fled the plantation. She grabbed Elijah's arm and pointed toward a game trail choke point roughly 60 yards distant. A route she had scouted the previous evening out of pure habit, the same habit that had kept them alive this long. "There," she whispered. "Move now. Quiet as you've ever moved in your life." They had been careless, or rather, exhausted enough to be slightly careless, having crossed the same section of creek twice in one day out of necessity rather than strategy, inadvertently laying down a stronger scent trail than usual. 3 slave catchers and 2 dogs were closing the distance fast, moving with the particular confidence of men who believed they had finally cornered their quarry. Mary and Elijah had by this point acquired 2 items that would prove decisive. A hatchet taken from an abandoned trapper's camp they discovered weeks earlier, and, through a contact in an informal network of free Black River workers who occasionally left supplies at agreed-upon locations for fugitives passing through, an old flintlock rifle with a small store of powder and shot. Elijah had spent hours in the preceding weeks teaching himself to load and fire it, using precious powder sparingly on practice shots against tree trunks, because he understood that a weapon he didn't know how to use was worse than no weapon at all. As the dog's baying grew closer, Mary made a rapid decision. Rather than running blindly, which would exhaust them and eventually allow the mounted men to run them down in open ground, she directed Elijah toward a natural choke point, a narrow game trail flanked by dense thicket on both sides, the only reasonably passable road through that section of brush. It was the kind of terrain feature she had spent years learning to read. The same instinct that had guided every decision since the swamp crossing on their first night. They didn't want to fight. They wanted an opportunity to disable pursuit and disappear. But when the lead dog broke through the brush ahead of its handlers, Elijah understood there was no more room for evasion. What followed was chaotic, brief, and terrifying. Elijah fired the rifle once, not at a man, but into the air, close enough to startle a horse that the animal reared and threw its rider, creating instant confusion in the pursuing party. In the ensuing scramble, Mary used the hatchet, not as a weapon against a person, but to cut down a section of overhanging deadfall she had identified earlier, collapsing it across the narrow trail behind them as they fled, creating a physical barrier that cost the slave catchers critical minutes to clear. By the time the search party regrouped, the fugitives were gone, vanished into terrain that had already swallowed them once before. The slave catchers involved in this encounter spent the following 2 days searching the immediate area, certain that the fugitives could not have gone far given the speed and chaos of the initial confrontation. They were wrong. Mary and Elijah had used the confusion to put nearly 6 miles between themselves and the search party by dawn. Moving through a stretch of pine barrens that Mary had identified weeks earlier as a fallback route in case their primary hiding grounds were ever compromised. It was a decision that reflected the deepest lesson of Mary's entire approach to the escape, that survival depended not on having one plan, but on always having a second, third, and fourth plan ready before they were needed. Elijah, in the hours immediately following the encounter, experienced something he would later describe as a strange mixture of terror and exhilaration. The realization that he had fired a weapon at armed men pursuing him and his mother, and that they had, for the first time, not merely evaded their pursuers, but actively turned the encounter to their advantage. It was a turning point in how he understood their situation. They were no longer simply fleeing. They were, in some limited but real sense, fighting back. This encounter, reconstructed here from period accounts of similar incidents common throughout the region, since detailed records of any single such event were rarely kept, became the foundation of the growing local legend. Stories exaggerated with each retelling. Some accounts had Mary and Elijah engaging in direct gunfights with multiple slave catchers. Others described them as nearly supernatural in their ability to disappear. The truth, as is so often the case, was both simpler and more remarkable. 2 people who understood the land better than the men chasing them, who used intelligence and preparation rather than violence as their primary weapon, and who were willing to take extraordinary risks rather than surrender their freedom. The failed capture attempt humiliated the slave catchers involved and intensified Josiah Whitfield's determination. He raised the reward. He hired an additional, more experienced tracker, a man with a reputation for successfully running down even the most resourceful fugitives, known in regional slave catching circles for his patience and his willingness to pursue a trail for weeks rather than days. This tracker, whom period accounts of similar figures describe as employing more methodical techniques than the average bounty hunter, changed the character of the pursuit. Rather than chasing Mary and Elijah's immediate trail, he began working the edges of their pattern, identifying the general territory they seemed to be operating within based on reported sightings and the locations of previous encounters, and static observation points at natural choke points. River fords, the few reliable trails through the swamp, locations where foraging or hunting would be most productive. He also did something more insidious. He began pressuring enslaved people on nearby plantations for information, using threats and, in some cases, promises of small rewards or favors, hoping someone with knowledge of the informal support network feeding Mary and Elijah might break under pressure. This tracker, reconstructed here as a composite of the professional pursuit specialists who operated throughout the antebellum South, kept detailed notes of every reported sighting, every abandoned camp, every set of footprints. Building a mental map of Mary and Elijah's operating range with the same patience a hunter might apply to tracking a wounded deer over the course of a season. He noticed, correctly, that the fugitives seemed to favor terrain features, creek forks, dense thicket, high ground with limited approaches, that suggested detailed prior knowledge of survival tactics, rather than blind panic. This told him he was dealing with something more dangerous than an ordinary runaway. A fugitive party that had planned meticulously and possessed real woodcraft. He adjusted his methods accordingly, spending less time chasing fresh trails and more time anticipating where Mary and Elijah were likely to go next, based on the terrain, the season, and the general northward drift he'd observed in the pattern of sightings. It was this shift, from reactive pursuit to predictive pursuit, that made him, by a wide margin, the most dangerous adversary Mary and Elijah faced during the entire journey. More dangerous than any dog, any patrol, any armed party that simply chased whatever trail happened to be freshest. This was historically one of the most effective and most morally corrosive tools available to slave catchers, turning the enslaved community's own survival instincts against itself. Some individuals under extreme duress did provide information to slave catchers throughout the antebellum period, though many others resisted at extraordinary personal risk, understanding that solidarity was itself a form of resistance. Mary and Elijah's support network held, for the most part, through a combination of loyalty, fear-driven caution, and simple lack of concrete information, since the fugitives themselves, understanding the danger, had deliberately kept even sympathetic contacts uninformed of their exact routes and hiding places whenever possible. Bula, the cook who guarded Mary's carved wooden bird, gave nothing away despite being questioned directly by Whitfield's overseer. The interrogation of Bula, in particular, illustrates the quiet, sustained courage that so often went unrecorded in the official history of this period. The overseer questioned her on 3 separate occasions, growing increasingly aggressive each time, at one point threatening to have her removed from her position in the kitchen house, a relatively privileged assignment compared to fieldwork, if she continued to claim ignorance. Bula held firm each time, her expression carefully arranged into the practiced blankness that enslaved people throughout the South learned to deploy as both shield and weapon. She had known Mary for over 20 years. She was not going to be the reason Mary's last living child ended up back in chains. Or worse. Similar quiet resistance played out on neighboring plantations as word of the pursuit spread. Enslaved workers who might have had scraps of relevant information. A sighting near a creek crossing. Strange footprints near the quarters. Often simply declined to volunteer it, understanding implicitly that their silence, however small an act, constituted its own form of solidarity with the 2 fugitives now moving through the wilderness beyond the fields. But the net was tightening, and Mary knew it. By early December, Mary made a strategic decision that would define the next and most dangerous phase of their journey. The methodical trackers' static observation points were making their usual territory increasingly dangerous. Staying in one general area, even one they knew intimately, was becoming a liability rather than an advantage. She decided they would attempt something bolder, a long push north, aiming not just to evade capture locally, but to actually reach free territory, or at minimum, a region with a more established and reliable network of abolitionist sympathizers and organized escape routes. The loosely connected system of safe houses, guides, and sympathetic communities that history would come to know collectively as the Underground Railroad, though the term itself and its more organized northern manifestations were still emerging during this period. This meant abandoning the relative safety of familiar terrain for hundreds of miles of unknown country, river crossings, and populated areas where discovery risk was dramatically higher. It meant relying more heavily on the kindness and courage of strangers. It meant walking primarily at night through territory neither of them had ever seen. Elijah, for the first time since the escape began, expressed doubt. The swamps and forests near their home plantation, however dangerous, were at least familiar. What lay ahead was a complete unknown. He voiced this doubt to his mother one evening as they sat sharing the last of a roasted squirrel over a carefully shielded fire, asking her plainly whether she was certain this was the right choice. Whether the devil they knew might not be safer than the devil they didn't. Mary considered the question seriously before answering, because she understood that her son's doubt was not weakness. It was the same clear-eyed calculation that kept them both alive this long, now turned toward a genuinely uncertain decision. She reminded him of Solomon, of the map he had carried in his memory for years without ever using it himself, of the fact that his knowledge existed now precisely because he had wanted, somewhere in his heart, for someone to use it the way Mary and Elijah now intended to. She reminded him of his two sisters and his brother, sold away to destinations neither of them would ever know, and told him that pushing north wasn't just about the two of them anymore. It was about proving, in whatever small way they could, that the system which had torn their family apart did not get the final word. Mary's response, as later oral traditions in the region would describe similar moments among other fugitive families, reportedly centered on a simple truth. Familiarity was no longer safety. The tracker knew their patterns. Staying meant eventually being caught. Moving into the unknown was terrifying, but it was also the only path that led somewhere other than back to Whitfield's plantation in chains. They moved north. What Mary and Elijah didn't yet know was that their decision to push toward free territory would bring them into contact with a network of people whose names history would barely remember, but whose quiet courage made escapes like theirs possible at all free black communities. Sympathetic river workers. And, in at least one documented pattern common to the era, formerly enslaved people who had established themselves in relative safety and risked everything to help others still in bondage. It would also bring them face to face, one final time, with the tracker who had sworn he would not fail again. Before reaching the blacksmith's town, Mary and Elijah faced a crisis that had nothing to do with slave catchers at all, and that, in its own way, terrified them more than any pursuit had up to that point. They had been pushing hard toward the river for nearly a week, rationing food carefully, moving mostly at night through unfamiliar terrain that offered none of the intimate advantages their home swamps once had. On a night thick with fog rolling off a nearby creek bottom, they became separated while crossing a stretch of dense cane thicket. Elijah pausing to free his shirt from a thorn snag, Mary continuing forward a few steps under the assumption he was still directly behind her. When she turned and found empty darkness, where her son should have been, something in Mary broke loose that 5 weeks of slave catchers, dogs, and armed men had not managed to break. She had spent 19 years building her entire existence around the promise that she would not lose this child. And now, in a swamp she barely knew, in fog so thick she could not see 3 feet in front of her own face, it seemed that promise might be undone. Not by an enemy, but by an accident. She did not call out. The discipline of months on the run held even through panic, since a shout could carry for miles in the still night air and bring exactly the danger they had spent so long avoiding. Instead, she used the signal she and Elijah had developed together, 3 soft, evenly spaced clicks of her tongue against her teeth, a sound easily mistaken for an insect or bird by anyone not listening for it specifically, repeated at intervals as she began retracing her steps. For nearly 20 minutes, the longest 20 minutes of the entire journey, by Mary's own later account, there was no answer. She moved through the cane in a widening pattern, her mind cycling through every possible catastrophe. That Elijah had been taken silently, that he had fallen into unseen water, that the fog itself had swallowed him, in the way it seemed to swallow every sound and shape around her. Then, faintly, she heard it, 3 answering clicks off to her left, closer than she expected. She found him crouched at the base of a cypress knee, having wisely stayed put the moment he realized they'd been separated. Understanding, just as she did, that 2 people searching blindly for each other in fog and darkness were more likely to end up further apart than reunited. They held each other for a long moment without speaking. Then Mary did something she rarely allowed herself in front of her son. She let him see her cry, briefly, before wiping her face with the back of her hand and pulling herself back into the steady, watchful composure that had carried them both this far. Never again, she told him. We touch every step through ground like that. We touch. From that night forward, whenever visibility dropped, fog, deep darkness, dense brush, Mary and Elijah moved with a length of cord tied loosely between them. An old trick Solomon had once described from his years living among Choctaw hunters, ensuring that no patch of swamp, however thick or disorienting, could ever again separate them without their knowledge. It's a small detail, easy to overlook in a story defined by armed pursuit and river crossings. A length of cord tying a mother to her son through the darkest stretches of swamp. But it captures something essential about how Mary and Elijah survived, as long as they did. Their greatest weapon was never the stolen rifle or the hatchet. It was the fact that neither of them, not for a single moment across the entire journey, was willing to let go of the other. That bond would be tested one final time, not by dogs, not by rifles, but by the coldest, most powerful force either of them would face on the entire journey, the river itself. Their journey north took them through terrain that shifted from the swamps and pine forests of their home region into hillier country, then toward the Mississippi River itself, whose crossing represented one of the most dangerous and most necessary obstacles of the entire escape. Along the way, they relied on a series of contacts within what enslaved people and free black communities of the era often referred to in careful and coded language as the road or the line, an informal, dangerous, and often life-saving network of safe houses and guides. Their first contact was a free black blacksmith in a river town, a man who had purchased his own freedom years earlier through an arrangement with a previous, less brutal enslaver, and who now used his relative freedom of movement to quietly assist fugitives passing through. He provided Mary and Elijah with 2 nights of shelter in a hidden space beneath his forge, food, and, crucially, information about the safest point to cross the river given current patrol patterns. Their stay with the blacksmith nearly ended in disaster on the second night, when a local constable, making routine rounds through the town in response to the circulating handbills describing Mary and Elijah, stopped at the forge to ask the blacksmith directly whether he had seen any strangers passing through in recent days. Mary and Elijah, hidden in the cramped space beneath the forge floor, could hear every word of the exchange through the thin wooden boards above them. The constable's voice was casual at first, almost friendly, the tone of a man making conversation rather than conducting an interrogation. But as the conversation continued, his questions grew more pointed, asking specifically about a woman and a young man traveling together, asking whether the blacksmith had noticed any unusual activity at his own property. Elijah's hand found the hilt of the hatchet in the darkness, not out of any intention to use it. Overt violence against a constable would have doomed them both instantly and permanently, but simply because his body needed something solid to hold on to while his mind raced through every possible outcome of discovery. Mary placed her hand over his, a silent instruction: stillness, trust, wait. The blacksmith's response, delivered with the practiced ease of a man who had navigated exactly this kind of danger before, was a masterclass in misdirection without outright lying. He mentioned, truthfully, that travelers passed through his town, constantly given its position along the river trade route, and that he couldn't possibly account for every face he'd seen in the preceding week, before redirecting the conversation toward an entirely unrelated dispute between two local farmers that he knew would hold the constable's attention far longer than any lingering suspicion about strangers. It worked. The constable eventually moved on, continuing his rounds through the rest of the town, and the blacksmith did not so much as glance toward the forge floor until well after dark, when he finally rapped the agreed, upon signal 2 knocks, a pause 1 knock, to let Mary and Elijah know it was safe to breathe freely again. Their second contact was even riskier. A white farmer with religious objections to slavery, part of a small but real minority of white Southerners willing to risk severe legal and social consequences to aid fugitives. He ferried them across a difficult stretch of river country in a false bottom wagon typically used to transport farm goods, a method of concealment documented in numerous accounts of underground railroad activity throughout the South and border states. Each of these encounters carried enormous risk for everyone involved. Mississippi law imposed severe penalties on anyone caught assisting fugitive enslaved people, and the social pressure within Southern communities to report such activity was immense. Every person who helped Mary and Elijah did so knowing that discovery could mean financial ruin, imprisonment, or worse. The blacksmith, in particular, took a moment before they parted ways to say something that stayed with Mary for the remainder of the journey. He told her he had helped 6 other fugitives pass through his town over the preceding 4 years, and that he expected to keep doing so for as long as his hands could still work iron and his neighbors remained unsuspecting. When Mary asked him why he took such risks for people he had never met and would likely never see again, he told her simply that his own mother had died in bondage without ever tasting a single day of freedom, and that every fugitive he helped felt, in some small way, like an act of justice done on her behalf. It was a sentiment Mary carried with her quietly for the rest of the journey, a reminder that their escape was never truly just their own. It belonged to everyone who had ever been denied the thing they were now risking their lives to claim. The farmer who ferried them across the difficult river country worked largely in silence, offering only clipped instructions and the occasional warning to stay low beneath the false floorboards of his wagon as it passed within earshot of a roadside patrol checkpoint. Elijah, pressed into the cramped darkness beside his mother, could hear the muffled voices of the patrollers exchanging pleasantries with the farmer above, and endured agonizing several minutes, during which discovery would have meant not just recapture, but likely violence against the farmer himself. When the wagon finally rolled clear of the checkpoint, and the farmer rapped twice on the floorboards to signal safety, Elijah realized he had been holding his breath so long his lungs burned. It's worth pausing here to note, with historical honesty, That resources like this, a coordinated network stretching across such a distance, were not universally available to every enslaved person attempting escape, and successful long-distance escapes of this kind, while real and documented in numerous historical cases, represented a minority of escape attempts overall. Many escape attempts were shorter in duration, more local in scope, or ended in recapture. Mary and Elijah's story, as reconstructed here, represents the more dramatic and ultimately successful end of a spectrum of resistance that took many forms, most of them quieter and less celebrated than a full journey to free territory. The methodical tracker hired by Whitfield did not give up easily. Having lost the fugitives' trail near the swamp country, he spent nearly 2 weeks working his network of informants and contacts along likely northern routes, eventually receiving word, whether through a paid informant, an intercepted piece of information, or simple deduction based on the direction of scattered sightings, that pointed him toward the river crossing region. Mary and Elijah were now approaching. He arrived at a crossing point roughly 2 days ahead of them and set up what amounted to an ambush, working with local slave patrols and a fresh pair of tracking dogs. What happened next represents the climax of Mary and Elijah's documented journey, reconstructed from the pattern of such encounters recorded throughout the era. As the mother and son approached the river, crossing under cover of pre-dawn darkness, guided by the farmer's directions to a specific, less watched bend in the waterway, the dogs caught their scent far earlier than either fugitive anticipated. The tracker, having correctly guessed not just their general route, but very nearly their exact timing, had positioned his men with brutal precision. What followed was the most dangerous encounter of their entire escape. Mary and Elijah, cut off from their intended crossing point, were forced into a desperate improvisation. Elijah, drawing on weeks of practice with the flintlock rifle, used their remaining shot not to kill but to disable, firing at close range into the ground near the lead dog. The loud report and spray of dirt were enough to send both animals into a frightened retreat that momentarily broke the pursuit's momentum. Mary, meanwhile, made a decision that speaks to the depth of her understanding of the landscape and the desperation of the moment. Rather than running along the riverbank, where they would be exposed and pursuable on horseback, she led Elijah directly into the river itself, into a current that period accounts of the region describe as treacherous even for experienced swimmers, trusting that the same water that threatened to drown them would also make them nearly impossible for mounted pursuers and dogs to follow. The tracker, watching from the bank, shouted for his men to follow along the shoreline, hoping to catch the fugitives when the current inevitably forced them back toward land. For several agonizing minutes, Mary and Elijah were entirely at the mercy of the water, pulled under repeatedly, separated by several yards at one terrifying point before Elijah fought his way back to his mother's side. Both of them swallowing mouthfuls of cold river water, both of them aware that a single moment of panic could end everything the same way a bullet could. Elijah would later describe, in the fragmentary ways such memories survived through oral tradition, the strange clarity that came over him in the middle of that crossing. A moment where the terror of drowning and the terror of capture seemed to cancel each other out, leaving behind only the simple physical work of pulling one arm after another through the black water, of finding his mother's hand in the dark and refusing to let go. It was by any measure an enormous gamble, but it worked. Fighting a powerful current in near total darkness, mother and son crossed the Mississippi River, or a significant tributary of the river system, depending on which version of regional oral tradition one follows. Reaching the far bank exhausted, freezing, and separated from most of their remaining supplies, but alive and free of the tracker who had hunted them for weeks. The tracker. According to later accounts that filtered back through the same informal networks that had carried news of the fugitives throughout their journey, refused to enter the river himself and was forced to report back to Whitfield that the trail had once again gone cold. This time, seemingly for good, Mary and Elijah emerged from the river well over a mile downstream from where they had entered it, dragged by the current into a stand of willows on the far bank, coughing up water, shaking with cold, and for a long moment simply lying in the mud, unable to summon the strength to stand. Elijah would later describe this moment. Again, in the reconstructed manner, such oral memories are typically preserved, as the first time since the escape began that he allowed himself to fully believe they might actually make it. Not because the danger was over. It wasn't. But because he had just watched his mother out-endure, and out-survive a man whose entire profession was built around capturing people exactly like them. And he understood, lying in that mud, that there was no obstacle left on their journey that Mary Carter did not know how to face. They rested only long enough to catch their breath before pressing on, moving away from the riverbank and deeper into the free, leaning territory the farmer had described to them. Territory where the balance of danger, though never absent entirely, even in nominally free states, given the reach of slave, catching networks and later fugitive slave legislation, had shifted meaningfully in their favor for the first time since October. Here, historical honesty requires an important acknowledgement. The ultimate fate of composite figures like Mary and Elijah Carter, representing countless real, but largely unrecorded individuals who attempted, and in some cases achieved escape from slavery during this era, is often impossible to trace with full certainty. Enslaved people who successfully reached free territory frequently changed their names, deliberately obscured their origins, to protect themselves and anyone who had helped them, and left behind few, if any, records that historians can point to with confidence. What we can say, based on the broader historical record of successful escapes during this period, is that fugitives who reached free northern states or Canada often settled in communities with existing populations of formerly enslaved and free black residents, sometimes finding work, sometimes continuing on to Canada to escape the reach of federal fugitive slave laws that, particularly after 1850, made even northern free states dangerous for escaped fugitives. Some formerly enslaved people who successfully escaped went on to become active participants in abolitionist networks themselves, using their own hard-won knowledge to help guide others still in bondage. A pattern documented in numerous real historical figures of the era. Whether Mary and Elijah Carter, as composite representatives of this history, found lasting safety, whether they were ever reunited with any of the family members Mary had lost to earlier sales, whether Elijah went on to build a life of his own in freedom. These details exist beyond what the historical record can confirm for any single account. What is certain is that their story, as a composite representation of documented patterns of resistance throughout Mississippi and the broader South, reflects a truth that mattered enormously both then and now. Enslaved people were not passive victims of an inescapable system. They were strategists, survivalists, and fighters who used every available tool, knowledge of terrain, family bonds, community networks, and sheer determination, to reclaim their own freedom against odds that were deliberately, brutally stacked against them. If we allow ourselves, as this narrative has throughout, to imagine the most hopeful, plausible outcome, consistent with the broader historical record, We might picture Mary and Elijah reaching a settled black community in southern Ohio or Indiana, drawing on the same resourcefulness that carried them through Mississippi swamps to build a modest, watchful life, always aware, even in freedom, of the long reach of slave, catching networks and the fugitive slave laws that would later threaten even northern sanctuary. We might imagine Elijah eventually finding work as a laborer or tradesman, perhaps drawing on skills sharpened during months of survival in the wild. We might imagine Mary, older now, finally permitted the rare luxury of simply living without the constant calculation of danger that had defined nearly every day since her own childhood. We might also imagine, as many real accounts of the era describe, a more difficult and uncertain ending, a life of continued caution even in freedom, of years spent listening for the sound of horses on a quiet road, of a peace that never fully arrived, even after the physical chains were gone. Slavery's damage did not end at the moment of escape. For many formerly enslaved people, the psychological weight of what they had survived and what they had lost along the way remained a lifelong companion. Both possibilities are worth sitting with, because both were true for different people who made the same desperate choice Mary and Elijah made. Freedom, once reached, was never a simple, uncomplicated ending. It was, for most who achieved it, a beginning, fragile, hard-won, and shadowed by everything that came before it. What we can say with total confidence is this: somewhere in the historical record that survives only in fragments, in family oral traditions passed down through generations, in the occasional runaway advertisement, or court record, or freedman's account preserved almost by accident, there were real mothers and real sons who made exactly the choice Mary and Elijah made. They weighed the terror of the swamp against the certainty of the auction block. And they chose the swamp. They weighed the risk of a bullet against the certainty of separation. And they chose the risk. Their names, in most cases, are lost to us. Their courage is not. The story of Mary and Elijah Carter, as reconstructed here, reflects patterns documented across thousands of real escape attempts throughout the history of American slavery. Historians estimate that tens of thousands of enslaved people attempted escape during the antebellum period, with the most famous routes and networks, the loosely organized system that came to be called the Underground Railroad, helping guide an estimated 100,000 people toward freedom between the early 19th century remained in the Civil War. Though precise numbers remain difficult to establish given the deliberately secretive nature of the network. Mother and child escape attempts like the one depicted in this story were both especially common in their motivation. Parents desperate to prevent the sale and separation of their children, and especially dangerous in their execution, since traveling with a family member rather than alone dramatically increased the physical and logistical challenges of a successful escape, while also increasing the emotional stakes beyond measure. The individuals who assisted fugitives, from free black community members to the rare sympathetic white Southerners willing to risk everything, represent an underappreciated dimension of this history. Ordinary people who made extraordinary choices, often leaving little to no historical trace of their courage. The professional slave catching industry that pursued fugitives like Mary and Elijah was itself a significant and often overlooked feature of the antebellum economy. Bounty hunters tracking dog breeders and the network of local patrols formed a system explicitly designed to make freedom as costly and dangerous to pursue as possible. This system did not operate in isolation. It depended on legal structures, from state slave codes to later, the Federal Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, which compelled even citizens of free states to assist in the capture and return of escaped enslaved people, and imposed penalties on those who refused. Understanding the scale and organization of this pursuit apparatus helps explain both how remarkable successful escapes truly were and how much courage, planning, and community support they required. It's also worth noting, in the interest of historical balance, that resistance to slavery took many forms beyond dramatic long-distance escape. Enslaved people resisted through deliberate work slowdowns, through the preservation of family bonds and cultural traditions against systems designed to destroy them, through quiet acts of sabotage, and through the simple, sustained daily act of surviving a system built to break them. Escape attempts like the one depicted in this story represent one of the most visible and dramatic forms of resistance. But they existed within a much broader landscape of everyday defiance that rarely made it into newspaper advertisements or plantation ledgers. And the fugitives themselves, the real Marys and real Elijahs whose individual stories rarely survived in detailed written form, but whose collective pattern of resistance profoundly shook the institution of slavery and contributed to the mounting political and moral crisis that would eventually erupt into the Civil War, deserve to be remembered not as passive sufferers of history, but as its active shapers. The story of Mary and Elijah Carter is a composite historical fiction narrative built from documented patterns of escape, pursuit, and resistance that occurred throughout Mississippi and the broader antebellum South. While Mary and Elijah themselves are fictional composite characters, the dangers they face, the strategies they employed, and the courage their story represents reflect the real lived experiences of countless enslaved people who resisted their bondage in ways both large and small, remembered and forgotten. This video was created for educational and historical remembrance purposes, to honor the memory of those who fought for their freedom against overwhelming odds. If this story moved you, consider it a small act of remembrance in itself, a way of carrying forward the names history tried to erase, the courage it tried to bury, and the truth it could never fully silence. Mary and Elijah's journey, in all its dramatized detail, stands in for thousands of journeys just like it, undertaken by real people whose stories deserve to be told. Even when, especially when, we can never know every detail of how they ended. Thank you for watching, and for remembering. This story presents a historical fiction narrative, inspired by the real patterns of resistance, escape, and survival among enslaved people in the antebellum American South. The characters of Mary Carter and Elijah Carter are composite figures. Their names and specific details are fictional, but the events they experience reflect documented realities of slavery, the Underground Railroad, and the brutal machinery of slave catching that existed throughout Mississippi and the wider South in the 19th century. This story is told for educational and historical remembrance purposes. Viewer discretion is advised as the content deals with the trauma of slavery, violence, and pursuit.